And we're go.
Yay.
Hi,
everybody.
everyone.
Hey, welcome back to the Sex Nerd Podcast. Hey, Josh, we're talking over each other.
Yeah, we are. Go ahead.
My name is Victoria Hartmann.
And I'm Joshua Corum.
And today we have a guest that I'm really happy to have on. He and I have been interacting with each other quite a bit over the last couple of years because of the similarities in what we study and what we talk about. Dr. Lee Mellor. I think I pronounced that right. I don't know. You'll have to correct me if I didn't. He is a Canadian best-selling author, criminologist, and profiler specializing in abnormal homicide and sex crimes. He's also a lecturer, a singer-songwriter, and the CEO
I saw that. I didn't get a chance to listen.
Media. Hi, Lee.
And I would argue probably the most interesting guy at the party, but go.
It sounds like a great introduction, unless you realize I've probably failed at some juncture on most of those things. That's why I'm now this. Actually, yeah, he's selling carpets, and you know what I mean.
So, Lee, what are you up to these days?
Indicative of a psychopath. Think about it.
That was one of my questions, actually.
When we talked, actually, he's like, that's a trait of a psychopath, and I'm just like, oops. So tell us a little bit more about yourself, Lee, and for the folks that are watching.
Where to begin? I guess we start with my interest in paraphilia and sex crime, including sex homicides. That seems most relevant to the show. So after I finished my BA in history in 2009, I had a period of illness for a few years. And I could only really focus on dark topics because when everybody's laughing at the sitcom and you're not in that headspace when you're going through something dark, it doesn't work. So I found an outlet for that in basically returning to an old hobby of reading about, at that time, it would have been specifically serial killers. And I thought to myself, I'm going to write a novel about a character called Joe Moon, who is an RCMP criminal profiler. So that's a Mountie in Canada. I'm Canadian. I live in Canada. And I thought that'll work. First of all, it's kind of original, and Canada's very regional. So, one part of it, you can have the prairies, another part you can have the mountains, and then you have endless woods and snow and sea. Very much like America. There's a lot of settings there. And so when I came to do this, I was coming up with stories, and you always start with the bad guys because they're a lot of fun to try and figure out their psychology. And of course, I was doing a lot of reading about criminal psychology and such at that time. And then I thought to myself, well, there's something weird about Canada in that we only had, say, like 3 official serial killers at that time. And when I say official, I mean that was the media narrative. We have so few serial killers. There's like these 3 and that's it. Now, people will contest that, but I'm telling you, that was the reality at the time, at least at a national level. It was Clifford Olson out in BC. He killed 11 teenagers and children of both sexes. And we had the Paul Bernardo, Carla Homolka case, probably needs not much introduction in the Toronto area. And that was a sexually sadistic couple that targeted teenage girls. And then we had the infamous pig farmer also out in BC, Robert Pickton, who is believed to have killed up to maybe 49 women, mainly Indigenous. He's sort of like our Gary Ridgway, and the whole point that kind of caught on internationally about that is that he would feed the victims to the pigs. But so I digress. The point was, I'm being told that, we've only had 3. And I'm thinking, no, we haven't. There's no way. Either this has been buried or it's been overlooked, but there's no way that our neighbor to the south has thousands, if not tens of thousands. And we have 3.
We're good at killing.
I know you are, but Canadians are really good at bullshitting too. So
so are Canadian serial killers like way more polite when they? I don't know,
man. They're pretty bad. But yeah, we have some bad ones. Yeah, and well, what interested me, we can get this down the line, is just how much the trends, the things you see them do, cut across international boundaries. But I'll get back on track. So I started coming up with all of these killers for him to profile and investigate. And then I went, well, what if I accidentally write something that resembles a crime that's already happened? I should really know if there are more Canadian serial killers. So I just went onto Google and I typed in Canadian serial killers, and it took me to a Wikipedia page, and there was probably about 6 or something on at that time, and very little information on all of them except the 3 that I mentioned to you. I was like, well, why don't I know about this? I don't know about these other 3 guys. And so then I went and I started reading more about them. And then it was like the more I excavated, the more I found. It's like, so then it went from 6 to 12, and it was like 12 to 20, and then 40. And all of a sudden, that novel I wanted to write just faded into the background. And I was like, this is the book that I'm supposed to write. The book I'm supposed to write is The Untold History of Serial Murder in Canada. And at that time, I had no training in psychology or whatever, but I had a rabid interest in the subject. And so I would buy the books. I'd buy all the old FBI, Wrestler and Burgess and John Douglas, and voraciously read that. And so at the same time, I was trying to get myself up to a certain level of expertise so that it wouldn't just be a lurid book recounting stories of mayhem, but also would be teachable at the same time, where I could say, look, in Canada, we also have like a psychotic killer, someone who's motivated by delusions. In Canada, we also have like lust murderers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that was sort of the level that I got myself up to. I wrote the book. It was my first book, Cold North Killers, and it was published. And that was pretty fantastic because you keep hearing about how everyone's rejected. I got lucky my first time, and I got published. And so because the book had never been written, because this topic had not been broached, all of a sudden I was being invited onto these academic listservs. I'd get onto the listserv with FBI profilers, forensic psychologists, like people I really admired, people whose works I was reading to inform my own writing. It's like, how did this happen? This is surreal. Like I just expected to write a book. I hope, if anything, I hoped it sold more. That I expected it might be like a big runaway hit, but I didn't expect to be invited into this community. And when that happened, because I have, I'm kind of a disinhibited person, and I'm not shy, put it that way. So they'll be having their conversation about what's going on. I'm just like, hey, I'm Lee. I wrote this book, and I just jump in and start arguing with an FBI profiler or whatever. And somewhere along the way, not only did I get a lot of positive feedback from people I really respected and could tell that they knew what they were talking about, I also realized I knew more about certain aspects of this than some of the people on the listserv. And that was when I thought, who knows? Like, maybe I could actually do this. Maybe I could make this jump. And so one of the people on the listserv was Eric Hickey, who is, I would say, the global expert on serial killers. Whether he's maintained that level, he's been so busy, he's had so much go on lately, I don't know. But at the time, absolutely. And I really get along with Eric. And I just said, hey, can I call you? And he said, yeah. So I called him and I said, I want to go back to school to study this. If I do, will you be on my committee? And he was like, yeah.
Wow.
It's like, is this really happening? It's really, really happening.
Wow.
Yeah. And so in 2013, I went back to the same school where I got my history degree, Concordia University. And because I hadn't done an undergrad in psychology, I wasn't able to get into a graduate, because I guess you have to start in undergrad stuff. At least that was the department's policy. And so I kind of went, I guess I'm screwed. And they said, well, hold on, though. We have this individualized program, which allows you to basically pick a specific thing you wish to study, and then you can choose from several separate fields. So profs from, you could take someone from they had suggested the women's studies at the time, and they'd suggested psychology, and that I could specifically study sexual homicide or whatever, drawing from all these different schools. And I said, that's a way that you can get into grad and still study what you want and still take psych courses. I was like, well, that sounds damn good to me. And it almost sounds better, to be honest, except, having that degree does not have the pop that having a psych degree has, unfortunately, on your resume, as I've come to find out. But sorry, it's a long story. So let's see.
No, that's fine. You keep going. Josh has to log out because he's fuzzy again, but you keep going.
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. So then I managed to go into the office, and I'm talking to the guy there about, okay, so my master's is going to take 2 years, right? And then how long for my PhD? And he goes, you don't need to do a master's. And I said, what do you mean I don't need to do a master's? He's like, you can go fast track into PhD. How the hell can I fast track into PhD? He says, well, you've written 2 books on this subject. He's like, do you know how much more that is than most students?
Wow.
Yeah.
Because by that time I'd written a second one, Rampage, about mass murderers and spree killers. That came out in 2013. And so I went, I'm not going to say no.
Oh, wow.
To this day, I wonder if, I might be wiser if I had done the master's, but I'm doing pretty good. So I managed to skip the master's, and I went right into the PhD program. And so then it was like, cool. Not only do I get to pick what I'm researching and different disciplines to do it from, but there is even an option to sort of work with a supervisor to create your own class. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, I had a psychology prof who was very interested in psychopathy. So I had a class called Psychopathy, where all I did was read about psychopaths. And that, I learned, I went above and beyond. I went to like the PCLR training under Bob Hare. And I went to a seminar with Mary Ellen O'Toole from the FBI to look at psychopathic traits at crime scenes and such. And so I got this whole semester just to read literature on psychopaths. And then I had classes on offender profiling, sex crimes and paraphilia with Dr. Eric Hickey. I had a criminology general, learn most major criminological theories, and then comprehensive exams. By the time I was done my comprehensive exams, by the way, throughout this whole process, I'm working on textbooks. I wrote 2. I have, look, this cover is not my fault. I commissioned, I'm fucking serious. I commissioned a necro-surrealistic artist called David Goff to do an amazing painting, and they wouldn't put it on the front because they said it wasn't academic enough. But let me just see if I can show you this. It's in here. This is what the book is supposed to look like. This is why you let artists have freedom. Hold on. But it's not art, it's academia.
And it's this book that connected Lee and I the first time.
Right.
Because I wrote a chapter in there. Yeah.
Yeah, you wrote about online
necrophilic communities, right? Yep.
Yeah, it's going to take me too long to find it. I will at some point. Here we go. Did I just see it? No, that was Girls and Corpses magazine. Okay. So I should say at the same time, that I'm doing my PhD, I'm also editing and writing really ambitious chapters, in my estimation, for 2 textbooks. There's also this one, Homicide: A Forensic Psychology Casebook with CRC. So this came out in 2016. The Understanding Necrophilia was 2017. And then I finally graduated in 2019. What happened was I took the hard road because I knew so much about necrophilia and sexual sadism and all those things that go bump in the night. By the time I had finished writing those books and my comprehensive exams, I felt I would almost be cheating myself. I could have just taken what I'd done for those books, put them into a dissertation and said, I'm done. Right. And I thought, no, don't do that. That's the easy road. What you need to do now is you need to look at offenders who do weird signature type behavior that isn't sexual. So like writing letters or posing bodies in a non-sexual way to convey a message. And at the time, I thought that was a great idea, and then I ended up in school for 4 years longer than I'd expected to.
Oh, I know that story all too well. All too well.
Yeah. But there is something about when you enter that, write your dissertation phase where I think there's maybe two types of people. The people that just say, I'm going to do it real lean, mean, and quickly and just hammer it out and do something very safe. I always tend towards being overly ambitious. So my dissertation was something like 600 pages when I initially handed it in. Yeah. And yeah, that was that was interesting. I had to start getting into semiotics and stuff with that, because when somebody say leaves a priest lying on the ground, fully clothed, I mean, no sexual interference, but with let's say a gay porn magazine they found in his house spread across his chest, and he's surrounded by party poppers and other things, like those are all symbols, those are all signs. So now all of a sudden I have to, in the last leg of my PhD, get into semiotics so I can understand all the potential things that could mean in relation to one another. And that all came into how signs and communication are basically the bedrock of our identities. And we can see that with, children who are put in isolation and they don't really have a sense of self, right? I'm talking about the extreme cases, the girl who was raised by wolves or something like that, or that kid that was locked in that room. They don't really know who they are. And anyways, I use that as a theoretical basis as to what might go wrong with these people and why they may feel a need to communicate. So I think that brings us up to kind of who I am. Let me just say, I authored the two books for the public: Cold North Killers, Canadian Serial Murder; Rampage, Canadian Mass Murder and Spree Killing; Understanding Necrophilia; Homicide of Forensic Psychology Casebook. Then I got to do a coffee table book that was just fun. That's like graphically lovely to look at. It's called The Crime Book. So I did a lot of research on all kinds of assassinations, white collar crime, thefts. Obviously, the serial killing and stuff went in there. By that time, I was getting a little tired of it. And then this year, I actually had a really good year. Not from a social perspective, but I rarely do, so that doesn't really matter. But when it comes from to writing, I wrote 2 books this year for DK Books, and they're not really related to what we're talking about, but it's worth mentioning. One was called Behind the Horror, which is looking at horror films and the true stories that inspired them. And so that was kind of fun. I got to flex a little bit more. I had about 3 months to write that. That was intense. And then they give me 2.5 months to write my latest one, which is coming out in February, called Conspiracies Uncovered. And if you have 2.5 months to learn about, say, 15 conspiracies, trust me, that's fairly challenging if you want to do anything other than something superficial. And especially when the JFK one is just thrown in there as well.
Oh, great.
Right. And the whole time you're like, just stop, man. Don't go any further. Don't go any further.
You're going down the rabbit hole.
I should also mention, I'm so sorry. I should also mention that I've been part of a cold case society since 2014. I was the head of the academic committee, and we've since restructured that. There's been changes in leadership. I got promoted to the vice president now. And
congrats.
Thank you. And I'm also head of behavioral. And this isn't like one of those sit online, pretend to be detectives, cold case societies. We actually work with police. So I get the confidential materials, the crime scene photos, autopsies, and we all consult together. And I'll just say that I think there's a good chance we might solve one next year.
Wow.
Yeah. We got some DNA. So
wow.
That's
nice.
the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases. And so that's the short intro to me so far.
Wow. That's quite a resume.
Yeah.
So I want to start with this question. So we talk a lot about sex on this podcast, obviously. Why do we put so much emphasis on the sexual aspects of killing?
Well-
Why is that? Why does that suddenly make it more, for the use of Law and Order, more heinous?
I don't think that it necessarily does make it more heinous. But of course, if you're dealing with someone who is killing because it sexually gratifies them, that is the main motive of the crime. And so you have to investigate it in that manner. And when it comes to like serial killers and what wannabe serial killers, that tends to be the most common motive. But we get into that. I think sometimes things are disaggregated to a degree which is kind of silly. Like you'll say, well, this guy's a lust killer, but this guy's just about power and control. And then you look at the criteria of each and you're like, these seem to both be just sex murderers. And you're just emphasize, like, of course, in most sex murderers, there's a great degree of power and control. In fact, in most murders, right? There's power and control involved in that. And certainly in lust murders. So yeah, some murders are just, I mean, they are simply the main motivating goal is kind of like this fusion of a feeling of power that is also fused with sexuality, and that usually happens, in the fantasy process.
That's an interesting question for you to bring up, Josh, because there's this disagreement amongst scholars, at least in my experience, of sexual crimes, especially violent ones that end in murder or what have you. It's solely motivated by sex, period. And then there's that other camp that says, no, it's power and control, as though it's somehow divided. And you see that a lot in conversations around like groups that advocate for survivors and so forth that have these crimes. There's this division, like, no, it's completely motivated by sex. And the other camp is, no, it's completely motivated by power and control, and they're separate. And what I'm hearing you say is that they're not.
Yeah, I'm almost always the little "why not both" girl from the taco commercial. I don't know if you've seen that. Like, do we have hard shells or soft shells? She's like, why not both? That's that's usually me. And so let me explain to you why that is the case.
Okay.
So this all begins in what is fantasy. But if you were to imagine fantasy as a space, I call it the fantasy scape. So, you know what that's like. You guys host a sex show. You've been in the fantasy scape, right?
Yeah.
Do you see it from, here's an interesting question. Do you see it from your own eyes, or do you see yourself in third person? I always see it from my own eyes. Fantasizing.
My own eyes.
It's
my own eyes.
Yeah.
I'd never thought of that before.
What about
you, Josh?
I don't know.
You're having a sexual fantasy. Do you ever see yourself, other than your dick, perhaps, in your sexual fantasy?
I think they're my own. I think both sometimes.
Yeah.
It just depends. Depends on how many people are in the room.
There you go, right?
I've never thought of that before. That's actually like, wait a minute.
That's a good one. That's like a good first date question. Like, so then, okay, all right. Well, what does that mean then? So
okay.
What does it mean? Yeah.
So we're there. We're in the fantasy scape. Now, we know that a lot of people who retreat into fantasy at a young age do so because they're avoiding a sort of noxious situation. I mean, they can be just geared that way anyways. I'm not biology is a big part of this for me, but really the whole point is that you have children spending an inordinate amount of time in fantasy. And I was one of them, but my fantasies were more like, well, wouldn't it be cool to be a cowboy or something like that? Or, coming up with ideas for novels I might write in the future or stories. Let's take a guy called Wayne. That's a popular serial killer name, right? And let's say that Wayne's stepfather abuses him really badly, and his mother allows it to happen, and she keeps making excuses for the stepfather. So Wayne's mad at the stepfather, might fantasize about shooting him or something, but he's also angry at his mother. And to escape this situation he's in, to kind of numb himself against what's going on inside his fantasy scape, he sees himself cutting his mother's throat, something like that, right? Because she's always making excuses. I just like to cut her throat. We all have, I think, fleeting moments where we have these thoughts, but they immerse in it and it becomes a source of retreat. And they're in it from a young age. And then as they start to get near puberty, so first of all, I would go back to that violent fantasy. There is power and control in that. I want to stop her making excuses for him. I want to cut her throat. I want to be the one in control of the situation. I don't want to be the victim, just in this example of Wayne. And so then he starts to get older, and as he gets near, into puberty, starts to actually be attracted to women sexually, or in this example, say women, and begins to have masturbatory fantasies, but his fantasy life is already established. So now maybe cutting mother's throat becomes accompanied by masturbation, or maybe mom gets phased out and it becomes that girl in class that Wayne has his eye on, and it becomes about cutting her throat. And then it can evolve more. It's like, well, maybe he's masturbating to it. He doesn't come when he's cut the throat, and then he has to keep going. Well, now what? Well, now the head comes off, and so the fantasies develop. And so this, I won't go any farther with this example, but this is kind of to show you how in these violent sexual homicide fantasies, there is no separation between power and sex. Like, power and sex are fused. As some people will argue that that's the case with all people. I don't think that's the case, personally. I think if you're doing that, you're reaching, because then you can say power in every aspect of human society, human interaction. But for them, it's like really fused. Like, these things are inseparable. And then, of course, you can throw in a thrill element to that, like the getting away with it, or just, especially if they're psychopathic, which they frequently are. I mean, just the rush of it. They're so understimulated, just the feeling of doing it and getting away with it. So when it comes back to some of those old serial killer typologies, the Holmes de Burger one being one of the most popular, where they had like psychotic killers, missionary killers. They basically kill people, for political or social reasons, killing groups of people they don't like. People who kill for material acquisition. I agree with those three groups in the typology, but then they had lust, thrill, and power, and they were all basically sexual homicides. I think that you just can collapse those into sexual homicide. Yeah.
Wow.
So is this kind of the in doing some of the research, it came across this term here, which is thematic derivative model of sexual progression. Is that kind of tie in there of how one thing just kind of leads to another, which leads to another, and then eventually, like you're saying, they actually act upon it, or they take it to that extreme to fulfill that fantasy that you were describing had been built since adolescence.
Exactly. And that's a great segue. Thank you. So this is the perfect time to discuss my thematic derivative model, which is something I first did for the Understanding Necrophilia textbook. Going back and looking, you always go like, man, I wish I would have changed this and this, and then it would have been perfect. But I am still pretty confident in it. And so let's talk about thematic progression of paraphilia. So I'll give you two examples. See how I did two with two hands? That's how fucking advanced I am at this. Okay, so, I also flash you both pieced. So yeah, with let's do like mutilation. So paraphilic mutilation, and then we'll do necrophilia. So let's look at someone like Jack the Ripper. And if someone wants to say, well, hey, man, they didn't catch him, I'll give you, trust me, there are other examples that are exactly the same. It's just well known. So if you look at Jack the Ripper, he got his name for a specific reason, because he liked to rip open his victims. And yes, they are sex crimes. Okay. Any nonsense about Freemasonry or a woman who wanted a uterus, I can debunk those in a second. But it starts off with what I believe is his first victim. She's stabbed about 39 times or something like that in the lower abdomen and around the genitals, and I think a couple times in the breasts. And so you've got stabbing, right? Which is really in the scope of what serial killers do. It's fairly tame. But then like a month later, the next victim, same areas, but now we're starting to see more like slashing and more concentration on slashing down here. There isn't guts or anything coming out yet. But now he's also posing the bodies too. So the legs are always left open, splayed. The third victim, same areas, slashing, but now organs are starting to come out. So, the coils of the intestines, and he's cutting bits off. Fourth victim in this, he's interrupted, so we'll skip that one. The same night he gets to another one, and now he's taking organs out. So they're finding organs missing. I'm trying to think, the kidney, I think the uterus was gone. But once again, the body's still posed and the wounds are all in the same place. But what you're seeing is an escalation in the extremity of the stabbing and the slashing, and at this point we're into probably a killing before we're into full out mutilation, right? And the last known victim, Mary Kelly, you could actually look up that crime scene photo. She's cut to pieces. There's not a part of her that's really intact, or there's very few. Mm-hmm. And so what you're seeing is it's definitely the same guy. And so anyone that says Jack the Ripper's a media construct is an idiot, because they haven't looked at other Ripper type cases, of which there are many. It's all located around the same area, and it's basically the same fantasy, but what it's doing is it's evolving to become more and more and more extreme. So it starts out with what if I were to, I can be crass on this show, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, okay. What if it starts out with jerking off, I just want to stab her in the pussy, it's something like that, right? Yeah. And then he does, and then next time it's probably relives that, but then starts thinking about, but then to, cut it open too, get right inside her. And so between kills, the fantasy is escalating along a theme, which is very predictable, and you can see it manifest in the signature. I think that's actually about as simple as I can put it to you. The necrophilia one is even more interesting, because you see guys like Jeffrey, like Dahmer, where you have going from because I'm trying to think. Sorry, Dahmer's got a bunch of ones that kind of overlap. I'll try and keep it simple. Going from drugging guys in bathhouses and raping them. Now, keep in mind, he could have had consensual sex with these men, right? But he chooses to drug them and have sex with them when they're unconscious. Well, do you guys know the term for that? When someone's sleeping or unconscious, the paraphilic attraction to that? It's
I don't know.
Somnophilia.
Somnophilia, that's right. Yeah.
Right. And then Dahmer also steals a mannequin, and he brings this mannequin home. Well, what's he use it for? He jerks off over it, right? It's a nice muscular male build. And so, though we could argue maybe it's just a surrogate, you could also argue that he's into Pygmalionism, which is sexual attraction to mannequin statues, etc. Mm-hmm. And then necrophilia. Once again, whereas with the Ripper, the theme is slashing and cutting and moving into mutilation. With Dahmer, it's all about just having this still body, right? Whether that person is unconscious, somnophilia, whether it is an artificial body that looks like it, Pygmalionism, or necrophilic acts, and that progression too, minus the mannequin, think about Ted Bundy, right? He's famous necrophile. Bundy would always knock his victims unconscious. You could say that's part of his MO, but like he would even come in when they were sleeping and get them when they were sleeping. And like almost all of them were knocked unconscious, and I think probably raped at that time. So I think that Bundy had like a somnophilic element too. He didn't like the women to be really struggling too much, or he liked them semi-conscious when he sexually assaulted them. And of course, what does he do? He comes back later and he has sex with their bodies. And not to get too confusing, he takes their heads of some of them too and brings them back home. But there's overlap between the mutilation and the necrophilia. But I'm just explaining the thematic progression. Does that make
it sounds like
sense?
Yeah. So in sociology, we have this sexual script theory, which is a kind of a fun theory that we look at how people derive how to have sex, right? Even when, where, with whom. We get it from cultural messages. We also have our own fantasies that we develop. And then we have these interpersonal ones that we develop with people. And this sounds a lot like that, but kind of turned up, of course, in a slightly different way, because it doesn't sound like, because to me, it sounds like it's more than just fantasy. You do have that interactive component where the person will modify it as they go, based on their victim. Like they'll enhance it, but but it's based on that interaction with the first victim. Right? Well, I experienced this with this person, so I'd like to change it and experience something different with the next person. So they still have to have that interactive component.
This is actually a great segue into the derivative paraphilia now too. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say you have a guy who takes a gun and approaches a woman at night. No, we'll make it a knife. Approaches a woman at night, pulls the knife on her and says, "I'm going to rape you, take off your clothes." She starts screaming. He puts his hand over her mouth and he cuts her throat. And he's killed her. So, I mean, this is a lot of things that people don't consider when we think about homicides. They don't realize that there are two or more parties involved, right? There's an actor and a reactor. And that's why so many people get this stuff wrong. And like in the Ripper case, the one victim that wasn't disemboweled, they go, well, that proves that he doesn't exist because of that one. It's like, no, he was interrupted, you idiot. So now your intention was to rape this woman at knife point, but you just killed her. And you do have some offenders that will say, you know what? I'm going to do it anyways. I don't care if she's dead. She's still warm. I guess, pretend she's alive or whatever. Then they'll have sex with the dead body. And then they realize, like, I actually enjoyed that. I might have enjoyed that more than actually raping them when they're alive. And so through this sort of accident, the original fantasy could have been like, I'm going to tear her clothes and, strangle her while I'm raping her. And then I'm going to come on her face and rub dirt in her hair. It goes from that to, because that goes wrong, he has to try something new and then realizes, well, actually that was better. Or maybe he doesn't think about it, but later he masturbates recalling it. And as a derivative paraphilia of say a certain type of rape fantasy, you now have have necrophilia, like legit. If he just does it once and then he never fantasizes about it again, or he never acts out on it again, I wouldn't call him a necrophile. I'd call him like a corpse molester or something, right? But once it's entered the fantasy scape, and whether it's in there and he's masturbating to it, or he's also acting it out, you now have necrophilia as a derivative paraphilia of the original sexual fantasy.
So essentially what you're saying is there's a social component to serial killers, to this aspect of it. Because we often think about this as only in their heads. It's purely psychopathy, but it sounds like there's actually kind of a strong social component.
Well, there's
of interaction.
Well, yeah, like microsocial, right? This is why when all the sociology reading I did that really informed my work was all like symbolic interactionism and Irving Goffman
sure.
and that kind of thing.
The dramaturgy
That's
stuff?
the sociology that interests me the most, how people interact in day-to-day life and build their identities. But yeah, I mean, a murder is an interaction. It's a communication, and there are communications within a murder, right?
I just don't think we ever think about it that way.
So there's a social and there's an experiential quality to what I just described, but also a derivative paraphilia may be something that happens without the need for the experiential part. I'll give you a concrete example. You're going to love this one, Dr. Victoria. Armin, I've always said Maives. I've been mispronouncing that, but the Rottenberg cannibal, the consensual cannibal case in Germany. So
very familiar with that one.
Yeah, there was I think it was a sexologist who did a great exploration of Maives's fantasy development. Okay. And Maives had, let's say, the primary paraphilia was sexual gratification from eating another male. So sexual anthropophagy. You could maybe argue it's vorophilia. We won't get into the distinction there. But consuming another man. But it had to be consensual. That's the interesting thing about the fantasy, right? But he finds himself masturbating to this grander. So when he begins masturbating, it's not just like, I'm eating the flesh. For him, it begins with he's up on the butcher's hook, and I start to cut. I start to make the incision. And what Maives found was that he was jerking off while having these fantasies, and then he would always be coming just on the part where he's butchering them, and he wouldn't even get to the part where he ate them, which was his primary paraphilia. So even though that may, and I don't even know if it matters, but that may have been still the most salient paraphilia, the point is that corpse mutilation has now developed purely inside his head, purely inside his fantasies, from the fact that it's making him come to think about doing it. Right. So that's a derivative paraphilia. So it can happen as a result of worldly experience, like the first example, or it can happen completely internally. And that's what I was trying to convey in that model.
What's interesting to me about what you're talking about is, I remember when I was first starting to get into the my graduate studies, and I had this, and I've told you about that when we've talked, is I had this grand idea of the progressive paraphilia, right? And my goal in researching, especially necrophilics and all the derivatives of that, was that I was going to prove that point. And what's interesting to me about what you're talking about is that in those that actually offend, that seems to be something that happens as you are defining with your derivative paraphilias. Now, in paraphilics who do not offend, it's the opposite. Their paraphilia is so specific, and if there's any veering from that at all, the sexual pleasure is not only eliminated, but they get rather upset. Like, say, for instance, if they're looking at fantasy imagery and so forth, if those specific aspects to their paraphilia are not there, it's done. It's over for them. There is no progression at all in pure paraphilics. It seems, though, what you're telling me, that in those that offend, that it does. I don't know if you want to call it progress, but it expands.
Well, it certainly does progress. I mean, that's why I think I call it the model of sexual progression. But I argued that you can do it along the thematic lines, which were the first I described, where it's really just an escalation of a theme. Or you have these completely unpredictable derivatives, like in the Maives case, or the rapist who becomes the necrophile because of the situational change. I did actually, though, to be honest, I came up with a term called contingent paraphilia. So we can disaggregate all of, say, Armin Maives's paraphilias. We can say, well, he was a sexual anthropophagist, so he liked to eat. He got sexually aroused at the thought of eating men. We can say that he was, and I had to make up some of these terms, I'm sorry, because no one had done it or done it right.
Right.
So, this is what I hate, because people roll their eyes when I say something. I'm like, well, you make up a fucking better word, asshole. You didn't even think of it, right? So
Yeah,
like,
that's why they don't publish theoretical papers in journals.
yeah, I know. Don't get me started.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah, I'm done with them. So necromutilophilia, which is mutilating a corpse. It's all over the place. I mean, the funny thing is the person, Sergeant Bertrand, for whom they had to come up with the term necrophilia, got off mutilating corpses and masturbating far more than actually having sex with corpses. So the original guy, I guess, for some reason, it's a common thing with necrophiles about mutilating the corpse, and we can get into that. It's mostly speculative for me, but I have some ideas. But for Maives, you have sexual anthropophagy, you have the necromutilophilia, you have I think visceralania, like an attraction to viscera. So we can disaggregate all this, right? We can say, yeah, this paraphilia, this one. But the whole point is actually none of them worked in the fantasy unless they all happened in a certain order under certain circumstances, which is exactly what you just described, I think, if I understood it properly. And what I called them is contingent paraphilia. Those paraphilia are only contingent on their relation to one another. So in his let's say script, it was that a man would love him so much that he would want to be eaten by him and therefore become a part of him. And sure, other parts of that process became sexualized, but this is why, like, the Maives case is so fascinating. It's the guy did volunteer that he killed.
He did.
It was a masochist.
Yeah, they found each other on a message board, and he did volunteer for that. Yep.
And he wasn't the only one, but he was the one that actually went through with it. There were something like half a dozen that, or maybe slightly less, that Maives actually had come to his house, and some of them chickened out, and some of them wanted to do things that were too extreme for him. I think one guy wanted to be nailed to the ground and like crucified, and Maives. Classic line. He's like, I thought that was a bit weird. So no, what you're talking about is absolutely true. Yeah, definitely. But you have to be able to wield a great amount of control to realize like that sort of contingent paraphilia. And I don't think that level of control is available to most lust murderers.
Yeah. Now, it occurs to me, this one question is, do you think that this progression or these contingencies, as they go along and they commit these crimes, is that biological in nature? Are we talking about brain chemistry or endorphin rushes and they're chasing that? Because then we start getting into this like addiction model kind of conversation, right? Which of course there's a lot of disagreement right now about how, and maybe, I don't think that necessarily the scholars that are talking about sex addiction or porn addiction or whatever are considering lust murderers. But from your experience, looking at the those that offend, what do you attribute that escalation to? Is it biological?
Well, a lot of them are. Okay, the escalation. Oh, well,
like Jack the Ripper. Let's use him as an example.
Okay, well. First of all, I should preface this by saying I really focused on the investigative aspects of it because to me, the etiology it's interesting, but it's not what I wanted to do for my job. So I've read papers that say things like exposure to, levels of estrogen in utero can result in like a brain that is more susceptible to paraphilia, but I can't direct you to that paper. I'm remembering these things, that I read here and there.
Right.
What I find interesting about paraphilia is I say there always seem to be like cockroaches. You might see one, but there's always like way more. It's very rare that you find someone that just has one paraphilia. It's always a bunch. So to me, I think that a lot of them are born with, a predisposition to it, but hypersexuality is a huge part of it, right? I mean, if you are constantly, and we're talking about all the time, thinking about sex, and you're one of those guys that beats off like 15 times a day somehow, Like you're going to go through what I might look at in porn in a lifetime. You're going to might go through that in a few months. Like that's how. And so then also if you tweak a couple knobs when it comes down to maybe things like self-control or like moral self-control, they'll look for novelty, right? I'm weird or maybe normal. You tell me that, to be honest, I've got like things I like and they've always stayed the same. If they've expanded a little, but I'm always within the same kind of, if I'm going to get off or watch porn, it's going to be something within this fairly vanilla realm. But I'm not hypersexual, right? I'm not constantly thinking about sex. I think that, and according to people who know and treat these sorts of people have told me, is that these people are thinking about sex so much that it's like, I've watched the bukkake like 800 times now. What if I just looked for like teens or something like that? And well, that's someone pretending to be a teen. I want like a real teen. And then 13 is there's only 1 year difference between 13 and 12, and you know what I'm saying? So they seek out novelty. So I think you also have hypersexual people that develop paraphilia simply because they are so sexually charged and they don't have, I don't know, the wisdom or something to not go down certain avenues.
So
But
Josh,
then again,
that throws us into now this argument that I can see your face. This argument that that some scholars are making, that paraphilias should not even exist as a category or a definition, and that hypersexuality doesn't exist as a definition, and so forth. So now we're getting into these two different lines of thought. And so I'm going to throw this back at you guys.
And so, but I think it's important to state that, like, as I'm listening to this, there's some things that I find interesting about this. Like, where's the line between sadism that, you enjoy with a partner bridge into psychopathy, right? So where are these lines that are established that makes a paraphilia, or a sexual behavior into paraphilia? And in the DSM, it's all about the individual, whether it causes them distress. So we're essentially labeling these behaviors
by necessity.
Yeah. Well, that's harm. That's something else then. But clinically, as the definition of paraphilia is, if it causes someone clinically significant distress in 6 months and impacts your life in some ways, somehow, but that has to be identified by you. Right. But if you have two people have the same behavior and one person, that's not a problem for them, then that's not paraphilia, that's a sexual behavior. So when we're looking at some of these behaviors that get paired with killings, it's like, it's just the behavior. I struggle with them being labeled paraphilias. It's just like, say, choking, right? You might have a guy who kills someone, he gets off on choking, and they happen to die, but Joe and Susie, he chokes her every night whenever they're fucking, and she's fine. It's the same behavior, why are we labeling one a paraphilia and labeling the other, a random Tuesday evening?
Yeah. Well, I guess what we'll do is
and that's why I go back to that original question of why we put so much emphasis on sex when it's paired with killing.
Well, see, I think a lot of maybe the BDSM community, I don't know how they'll react to this, for instance, but okay.
No, I'm kidding. I think it's great.
But for instance, sexual sadism, non-consent is implicit in the diagnostic criteria. So as we know about BDSM, there is consent. I mean, there's safe words, and there's conversations, I think, that happen a lot of the time about what is expected, right? There's, depending on who's doing it, but
depending on who's doing it, but then you also have those conversations of people go, here's what my limits are, and I want you to push me past those, right? So their consent gets messy again.
And those aren't your limits. You know what I mean? Then you're playing
that's
silly.
that's
You're
where
playing
it
silly
gets like
games.
messy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely stupid to do that. I mean, what are you thinking then? Because now the person doesn't know what your limits are. So now how like how do they know when they're, for lack of a better word, sexually assaulting you or not? Because you just said I push me past my limits. ... Well, I didn't mean stab me in the asshole. Rape. You know what I mean? Like,
that is good. That is a very valid question. So coming back to what you were talking about, Lee, is it then, does it come down to consent?
Oh yeah. And that's right in for sexual sadism. That's right in there. So, now that's a paraphilic disorder too, right? We have to distinguish between those things. I think the DSM is getting better at this, right? Where you can say, look, your foot fetish, podophilia, it's unusual. I mean, it's not what most people find sexually attractive, like especially when there's a focus on it. So it's unusual. It's not a problem. Unless it causes you distress, at which point it becomes a disorder, right? If you are so torn up about, or it's ruining your sex life, or you can't find a partner, or you're ashamed, or whatever it is, then it's a disorder, and we need to treat you for you to help you, right?
Yeah, but it's often it's as we've talked about in the past. It's not the behavior; it's shame. Just like you said, majority of time, if it's causing significant distress, is because the individual feels shame.
For sure.
And the behavior. So it's not the behavior. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrapped up on, is like they're focusing so much on the behavior being this issue rather than the individual having the issue. It's whether it be shame or compulsion or something like that. It's not, those are more of the underlying issue.
So then are we talking about using paraphilias and the manifestation of them as markers to identify a particular like killer, or because it doesn't sound like in your investigations paraphilias are being sort of broken down into why they're there and what this person's motivated by. It's simply that they're used as markers to define killers in order to find them or to whatever, convict them or what have you.
In my world, and so that's why I'm so focused on this. Let me give you a good example of why this is important.
Okay.
And so there was two killers operating in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, around the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s. And they both cut and stabbed their victims, but there's important differences. And spoiler alert, one of them was a guy called Derek Todd Lee. He was a black guy with mostly white victims. FBI fucked that one up because they did the old mistake of, well, if it's white victims, it must be a white perpetrator. Not so much with serial killers, right?
Okay.
Especially ones that prey on sex workers, by the way. These victims were not sex workers. But Derek Todd Lee was, I don't know what his paraphilia would be. I mean, he was a voyeur. He was a window peeper. Basically, he would rape women violently and then just really furious overkill. And so whether that overkill was sexualized or whether it was an expression of rage, I don't know. But when I say overkill, I mean like you stab someone 97 times, right?
It's a lot of rage.
That's right. Can you imagine that? So though I think with a psychopath, you could have that, and sometimes that might be sexualized. It also might not be, right? I can really imagine how it's not. There's the other guy at the same time. Really interesting MO and signature with this guy. What he does is he lures mainly black prostitutes into his car off the strip in Baton Rouge. And then when they're not looking, he takes an industrial zip tie and he puts it over their neck and he tightens it. And then they're on auto strangle, right? This dude's a pothead, by the way. I always found
Dude.
that part hilarious.
Whoa.
Like, well, for sure. And you know, I always have this little devil part of me that like collects the good ideas. And it was like, that one is very clever, right? Because if you're a necrophile, that is.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so that's what he is. I mean, he doesn't rape them when they're alive. He doesn't even have consensual sex. He just gets them into the car, zip tie over the head. Then what? They can't scream. They can't ask for help. They're at most they can run around for a bit before they pass out. Then he's got their body. He puts it in the trunk of the car. He, depending on the circumstance, takes it home or takes it somewhere else. Now, some of these victims were simply raped post-mortem. So no mutilation, just rape. Some of them were cut to pieces and their body parts used sexually. Some of them were eviscerated post-mortem. You know, some of them had mutilation and necrophilic penetration. But the point is, post-mortem, it's the corpse, right? So whatever the activity it is, I mean, in the one case, I don't know, let's call it like necrocoitolania or something, just having sex with a corpse, like that manifestation of necrophilia versus necromutilophilia. The point is necro, right. Which was Greek for corpse. And so what I do is I probably not enough people are going to watch this, so I can get away with this. Whenever I'm training police or students of psychology or whatever in this topic, I usually stop mid-lecture after I've covered all the necrophilic stuff, and I hand out an assignment which describes each of the homicide victims from both of these killers. And I say, I want you to tell me how many killers are at work here, and I want you to group the homicides. So tell me, you know, 1, 8, and 9, I think that's killer A. So not only are they trying to figure out how many killers there are, but they're trying to link them. And no one's ever got it completely right. But it's amazing that even after spending so much time explaining these necrophilic concepts, people will still miss it. And then when you show it to them, you go, guys, what was I telling you? Everything this guy did was post-mortem. Everything. Then they have that aha moment. And so it's trying to get people into understanding that. And that can trick systems too, like say VICAP, where you feed in, that is the program that links crimes across the United States, and not in every state, and it's flawed and underused. But the point is, it might not link, say, somebody who is raped post-mortem to somebody who is eviscerated post-mortem, but we have plenty of evidence to show that I mean, it's both necrophilic activity. So the system should be making those links. So that's sort of my thing. That, you know, that's what I'm trying to get across.
I know we're kind of getting a little low on time, but I wanted to ask, you mentioned these two killers. This is kind of derailing just slightly. And this is actually a question that comes up whenever I just casual conversation. Not that I have a lot about serial killers, but they're kind of popular, right? Serial killers are popular. You mentioned those two as being the end of the 90s and the beginning of 2000s. Why don't we see more? Because I'm sure they're out there. Why don't we see more reports of serial killers? They're so popular in you know, TV and just people are reading about them. What's changed, or has anything changed? Because I feel like in the last 10 years, maybe even 15 or more.
Right, it can be in comparison to like the 70s, right? Like, 70s and 80s.
Yeah, or the 70s, were in the 80s.
And we don't,
Oh, yeah. And there was more of them in the 80s, too. I mean, it was just, and crime in general was at like a fever pitch around the 70s.
Has our mental health gotten better?
Well, I think one of the explanations could be that it's harder to be a serial killer now because of DNA technology and cameras everywhere and phones. And so, you know, maybe the guy that would have been a serial killer gets caught after one sort of thing. Right. Also, like the focus, I think has shifted more to rampage killers, like so mass murder, spree killers. I think that's tied in a lot with the internet, because you can broadcast your manifesto, right? You know, oh, hi, my name is Chris, and I'm doing this because, you know, I can't get any titty, and then that sort of thing, right? And and then it gets tied into like the politics of guns and all that. So that could be one explanation. They're also like the last one that really popped was Dahmer, right? And that was around 1990, 91. It was the same time that The Silence of the Lambs won the Academy Award. It was almost like it hit a cultural apex at that point, and then people got sort of tired. But there was a lot of interesting cases after in the 90s. I mean, you had the Bernardo Homolka case in Canada. In the UK, you had Fred and Rosemary West and Harold Shipman. You had probably one of the most intense cases of sexual sadism in a serial killer ever in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, no less. David Parker Ray in 1999. But you're right. Yeah, they're there, and I look at them and I get little Google alerts, right? Serial killer. But whenever you read it, it seems so dull. You know, shot 4 transgender women in a week and a half period, has now been arrested. You know, there doesn't seem to be I think a big part of it is either like the revelation of like, and in this house that, you know, you didn't know about was this, right? That's a rare event anyway. But I think the days of there's a killer at large and he could strike anywhere, and this has been going on for a long time and we can't catch him, those days seem to be kind of gone. Like they're fewer, right? When was the last time that you guys were like, man, there's a killer at large and in my community, right?
Yeah, you don't think about it anymore.
I mean, the last time for us that it happened was October 1, few years ago, you know, and that was done and over with. And, you know, and the only reason he would be defined as a serial killer is he'd like, you know, showered a hail of bullets all over a concert, you know, in the span of like 5 minutes.
Well, he would be a mass murderer, right?
Yeah,
he'd be a mass murderer.
I mean, but if we're talking about numbers, right? When you think of serial killer, you think numbers, and if we're talking numbers, I don't know that we have that kind of thing that really is at the forefront of the news anymore. Now we talk
more
about
the methodical.
Yeah, we talk
serial
about
killer goes back to normal life. Right? Yeah, that's the main difference, is that serial killer will kill, and then they have a whole what life. I call they call a return to routine, right? So even if that routine is weird, like, and then he went home to the shed and took out his favorite skull and looked at it and jerked off, put on his uniform and went to work for the postal service, right? I mean, even if it's a bizarre routine, they can commit the crime and then return back to civilian life and then come out and do it again. Someone like Stephen
there's
Paddock,
years that passes between incidences.
For sure. Yeah, exactly. And I think that depends on a lot of the control over the compulsion, which, then we're getting into things like degrees of psychopathy and impulse control and all that. But with the mass murderers or the spree killers, once they've committed, there's no going back. Yeah. Because they've made themselves so visible. They never intended to get away with it. Right. Usually they think this is going to end in my death. Right. Yeah. And sorry, by the way, the mass murderers typically are not sexually motivated. Right. There may be sexual things about their motive, but it's not paraphilic, if you get my meaning. Yeah.
I wonder if, so we talk about community. A lot of times you can find solace in different communities, like the ethical pedophile, or the what is it? It's not ethical pedophile. What is it? The virtuous pedophile group, right? Virtuous pedophile group, so that it helps them prevent from
child molestation.
Right. Yeah. And I'm wondering if the growing incel group community is kind of squelching some of this, because if you look at a lot of the tendencies from that incel group, the ideologies that they have, you you could make some crossovers of previous serial killers. Especially being sexually frustrated, not having access to this, it becomes an equation for them where they're like, well, if I do this, this, and this, I should get laid, but it's not adding up and I don't understand. So I'm just going to, take it out on women.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's not if almost these incel groups, online communities and whatnot aren't preventing more serial killers because, I don't know, you have someone to bitch to. That seems minimizing, I understand, but to a certain extent.
Yeah, I think the issue is that term was introduced to us with Elliot Rodger. I'd never heard of it before.
Who did kill a bunch of people, right?
To me, that's another generation thing. You would never dream of going on the internet and talking about how you can't get laid, especially posting videos. Like, I'm no judging, but that was not where I came from, like that time and place.
Right.
It's also not a very good strategy, guys, to be honest with you, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But we mostly hear about incels in the media. It's kind of sad, actually. The only time that people pay attention to this group is when they do something bad, right? I do think that, I think that the vast majority of them, it's hard for me to say how misogynistic these, they can be and what percentages of them, but there's definitely within that community, there's a feeling of, well, me too, man. I know the struggle. I know the frustration. So that definitely exists. And if that helps them in some way, it's when the ideology comes in, right? That's where I think it gets troublesome, and they start to make categories and things will never get better. And there's never a chance at improvement. There's like some people in the community that almost want to weaponize it,
Well, and I think that also, when you're talking about actual crimes, you're me and cluster B disorders, like I think you see a prevalence of what, the cluster B disorders in those that offend, right? Which you don't see in pure paraphilics. But you see that because, and I think a lot of it comes down to what, Lee was talking about earlier was the thrill, and that's a chemistry thing. So,
yeah. But I also wonder if porn isn't like not a catalyst, but an outlet for some of these individuals as well. Because if we're basing this strictly on like lust killings, right, where they have some paraphilia, they have some sexual interest that's driving them, with shame or something like that, you can get your release online. You can find some of that.
Paraphilics, but those with these kinds of psychopathies, these cluster B disorders, there's actually the research shows that it doesn't affect them at all. There's no thrill. There's none of that. It's the act. Yeah.
But if we're talking about some of the basis for some of the psychopathy or these serial killers that we're talking about, that they have the fantasy that develops, it gets reinforced through masturbation, and suddenly it becomes escalation. They need to act it out. But a lot of times you can see that stuff online.
Yeah, like I said, the research shows that that in terms of that, the kind of reactions in the brain that you see in those with psychopathies, the pornography often doesn't give them that kind of reaction. Their brains just don't respond to it that way. Paraphilics, yes.
They need the tactile stimulation.
It has to do with the thrill of the power and control, and you can't have power control over pornography. So, yeah.
Right. It could give you some ideas. I mean, if you're watching,
exactly,
a woman being humiliated and whipped and stuff, you could say, well, that's going into the, the fantasy now. Right. But, I don't think porn is enough. Although, I mean, they have found that, really violent porn on the computers of people who are lust murderers, but I don't think the porn made them do it. I don't think they were like normal people going through life and then, I saw a drowned pussy video and now I drown women compulsively. No, they start out from, I'm the kind of person that would look for drowned pussy video, and that's how they get there. Yeah, exactly.
I know. I could, and every time I'm on with Lee, I just want to talk forever, but we are like 14 minutes past the hour. So, we should absolutely do this again because there's so much more to talk about. Josh, do you have any, like, I know it seems like a weird interruption, but Josh, do you have anything, like some final thoughts or anything that you want to add, or a summary at all?
No, I like the idea that, because again, as a sociologist, I always like to take things back to social interaction or some theory, that aspect. So it's interesting to see someone actually doing that, taking serial killers or mass kill, just killing in general, to a social component, because we often don't do that. We often psychology has the domain on this, and rarely do they stretch it to the social interaction component as being something that can create or influence the escalation or the derivative aspect that you were talking about. I'm not saying I like that. It's like, oh, this is great sociology. We can be, but I appreciate that someone's trying to do that, and someone's trying to add that social component as it just being pure personality or pure psychology.
You can, you can divorce any of these things, right? I mean, to me, everything is biopsychosocial, all of it. Your biology influences your psychology, which influences your social interactions, and then your social interactions influence your psychology, and not to the same degree, but we know through things like neuroplasticity or whatever that it may actually, over long periods of time, change your brain. So for me, the idea that
genetics,
anyone separating these things, I believe, has got it wrong. And I think the future is in the interdisciplinary study of most of what we call social sciences. I think we need to stop separating them.
I agree.
That's a nice that is a good way to wrap up the show.
Although there's certain parts of social science that should just be cut off and kicked into the fucking.
Say that about any discipline.
I feel like they're doing that on their own and making subfields.
Right.
We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, we will leave it at that.
Well, Dr. Mellor, I really appreciate you being on with us today. It's always a fascinating conversation with you. And so what we generally do with the wrap up is, Josh, take it away with we have this and that and the YouTube and all that stuff, because I always forget it, because I just like.
All right, if you're watching us on YouTube, hit and subscribe. If you're also watching us on YouTube, go watch it on Get Vocal, because
and it is live broadcast on YouTube now. Yeah, it's all linked up, so it does live broadcast.
Yeah. And as we go further and we start advertising these, you can watch them live. We should start really advertising that. Watching these live. I know we have somebody popped up, which is great. And then we also have our Twitter, which is @Sectionary Podcast. We have Instagram. We have Facebook. We have all the social media things that you should go find us and whatnot. What about you? Lee, what do you got?
I'm on
Instagram,
Twitter,
Facebook.
but you don't want to follow me. It's a fucking dumpster fire. You do probably want to listen to my podcast, Murder Was the Case.
Yes.
Where we do have serious discussions. It's not like, oh, this murder was so
not
creepy. Like,
definitely not
not at all. It's like serious adult conversation. And yes, we do joke and stuff too, but Murder Was the Case. Check it out. If you found what we were talking about today interesting, then you're gonna like Murder Was the Case. And then you also have the books that I authored. I would encourage you to look into those.
Yep. And we'll put a listing of those on the YouTube channel. So. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for spending some time today. And I'm looking forward to more conversation. And Lee, congratulations on this big change that's coming your way. And I hope that
no reveals yet. We'll see if I can pull it off.
Right, but I hope that it's the positive change that you're looking for. So
thank you. Me too.
With that, we will.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
And thank you. We will see everybody next week. Thank you.
See you next week.
See ya.
Bye.